and welcome to Fresh Ears, Fresh Air's fortnightly podcast, where we dive into the world of podcasting from the perspective of brands and businesses. I'm Michaela Hallam, the Director of Content.
And I'm Neil Cowling, the founder. And today we're joined by the brilliant Jainnie Cho, VP of BBC StoryWorks at BBC Studios, talking about the power of storytelling for brands with a BBC badge on. So if you've listened before, you'll know that we also like to make sure you're up to date with the latest happenings in the world of podcasting and audio too.
And of course, we will have a podcast recommend, which is a top pick of the podcasts that you should be listening to. And this week, that recommendation comes from Jainnie Cho herself. So stay tuned for that.
So before we get into all that, let's hear our interview with Jainnie Cho of BBC StoryWorks.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast, Jainnie. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We've already done kind of part of your introduction, VP of BBC StoryWorks. But kind of before we go into what your role looks like now, I'd really like to go back a bit and talk a bit more about what led you to where we are today, because you've worked across some serious, mighty heavyweight publishers. You've worked across NBC Universal and New York Times, T-Brand Studios, which is where we first met. So talk to us a little bit about your kind of career journey to date.
Sure. So I would describe myself as a journalist turned branded storyteller. So I first started my career as a journalist in Korea for a newspaper, and I covered all sorts, including current affairs, business, culture, and features writing too. And then I moved to London over a decade ago, decided to marry a British man, continued with journalism. And then at some point, I think this was around 2016, 2017, branded content really captured my attention and imagination. And there were several kind of impressive branded content campaigns by different publishers at the time who were opening up branded content studios that really piqued my curiosity. And, I remember just kind of seeing the film output and kind of the written output and the digital experiences. The reporting was so thorough. The stories were really original, and there was a point of view. And, within those stories, they were like really, really sleek, high production value, and overall very impressive. So I thought if this is branded content, then I'd love to be a part of it. So I actually applied for an editor position and started my career in branded content. I think it kind of follows my, philosophy, if you will, on, kind of content in that, a good story is a good story, whether it's from a newsroom or from a commercial content studio.
And that's what it all comes down to is brilliant storytelling.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you find that surprises some people, Jainnie? Because I think some people in what we do as well, they think that as soon as a brand gets involved, then, it all gets a bit dirty or it all gets a bit selly. And the idea of journalism sort of goes out the window. But we know, and clearly your experience is that that's not true.
Yeah, exactly. And, just speaking for myself as well, I remember, kind of when I was a journalist and I didn't know much about the branded content industry, I had some kind of biases as well in terms of paid storytelling and what that means for the integrity of that story. But I think branded content has come such a long way since its inception. It used to be kind of called advertorials, way back when. But now there's such a breadth of content out there that, partners with clients. And I just don't see any kind of bias against branded content as kind of a modern way of approaching storytelling.
Yeah, that makes total sense. The branded content storytelling evolution of the advertorial is something that is relatively new, especially in the way that it's being done and to the levels it's being done now. When you were growing up, was a journalist the thing that you always wanted to do? Was it always storytelling? Kind of where's that interest in that storytelling come from?
I always loved stories reading them, writing them. And, it's kind of telling of my age, but, I come from the magazine generation. So I had a huge kind of magazine collection. Sassy was my Bible, and a book collection as well. And so I was always kind of a curious person and loved finding out about different people's lives within that. And so that kind of led me to wanting to do something creative, having a voice, and wanting to do a job that involved me telling stories, interviewing people, finding out about them, and writing about that as well, which led me to journalism. And I still see that as such a privilege that I was a part of that community.
As soon as you said advertorial, my mind went to magazines straight away. It was the first thing. So yeah,
Absolutely.
It says my age too.
Is there a particular story or particular campaign you've worked on, Jainnie, that sort of encapsulates that ambition and that quality of storytelling that you always wanted to do?
I can't just pick one because every campaign is so different. And there's something I, always, when I look back on campaigns that I was involved in, I'd like to do more of. But, having said that, favorite campaigns, I think, just kind of in general for me, are those that kind of challenge people's preconceived notions of something, and makes you look at something completely differently. Because of how that story was told. So I can give you a StoryWorks campaign example that I wasn't personally involved in. This was before my time, but I remember being very impressed by, which was a campaign a few years ago for DHL. And, the ask was to create an emotional film series for a B2B audience, which is easier said than done. How do you make engaging stories about a logistics company targeting business decision makers, and I think the team really focused on kind of real life impact that DHL's technology had on kind of real humans around the globe. So we told a story, for example, of a South Korean working mom CEO, Erin, who founded a baby carrier company that helped kind of mothers globally redefine what it means to be a working mom. We also filmed how DHL's tech really helped a Swedish boy who had this kind of rare neuromuscular disorder play games he loves and just like his gamer dad. And I love this campaign because it helped kind of shape the notion of DHL's technology in a way that actually means something for people in their everyday lives.
That's great. It's not about telling the story of what the brand does necessarily, isn't it? It's about telling the effect that it has, or the stories that it can make happen.
The real life effects, because that's what at the end of the day, audiences care about, right? And I always say to my team, a B2B audience, they're people too. They're decision makers, of course, but they're not just kind of hollow business buildings that you're talking to. You're talking to human beings.
Absolutely.
You just referenced that as a BBC StoryWorks campaign. So can you explain what BBC StoryWorks actually do?
Sure. So in short, we tell stories that are paid for by brands and live on BBC platforms and beyond. And these stories are distributed throughout the BBC ecosystem, including bbc.com, linear, audio, and social platforms as well. And BBC StoryWorks, that's quite unique. The branded content that we produce can only be viewed outside of the UK as a part of our commercial operations, and is separate from the UK public service editorial output as well. So in terms of the audiences that our stories are speaking to, they're very high value, educated, affluent, and engaged business and social leaders and influencers who look to the BBC to help them make sense of the world around them. At StoryWorks, we tell brand stories the BBC way. So we take inspiration from our editorial teams on how they approach stories through a journalistic eye, through a documentary eye. We are also inspired by learnings of BBC audience behavior, and our storytelling strategies always kind of take into account how, our BBC audiences behave and engage with content.
Does that mean that you can interact with and work with BBC IP? or is it new storytelling and devices that sit around BBC IP?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. We are the creative studio within BBC Studios, and advertisers come to BBC StoryWorks to create content as part of TV, audio, and digital campaigns that sit within BBC's ecosystem. So, in terms of the branding portion of that, BBC for clients and the world provides a very trusted premium environment, right, for clients to tell their stories. And StoryWorks has, of course, the global experience and sensibility to ensure that those stories are authentic and resonate with the right audiences.
We tend to take the BBC for granted a little bit, being based in the UK, don't we? I think we all have the experience of in our careers going abroad and talking about the BBC and seeing the way that it's respected, what that badge means around the world. It's a real mark of quality, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, coming from South Korea, where I'm kind of born and bred, I think BBC has a special resonance in that part of the world as well, with kind of public service and kind of the world services, and BBC News Korea now, in that country too. And it is a marker of respect. And going back to trust, we are the most trusted international broadcaster in the world, bar none, verified by multiple sources year after year. And, that there is such a privilege in being part of that kind of organization.
That's a really interesting point, that kind of trust and integrity that the brand is known for worldwide. Does that impact which brands you can work with? And is there a way of kind of deciding whether or not a brand is appropriate to kind of sit within that wider BBC ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that personally, in my experience, was quite unique to the kind of workings of BBC StoryWorks as composed to the experience I had with other kind of publishers in the media industry, in that the internal compliance process, whether that's kind of checking to see whether we can work with a client, or the types of stories that we could tell, or the sponsorships that the client can be involved in, are very strict, and it involves multiple layers of compliance feedback from various members of the team, which, as a commercial entity, sure, it can mean that our responses are kind of delayed sometimes for certain briefs. But I think it's integral to have that kind of compliance system, and for us to kind of, keep the trust upheld from our audiences.
So can you give us some examples of who those clients are? What are the most notable clients that you've worked with in the last few years? What sort of brands are they?
I manage the EMEA team of BBC StoryWorks. So you can imagine there is such a kind of diverse, kind of rich breadth of different clients we work with. So, at any given day, our strategists can, answer a brief from a logistics company like DHL to a tourism campaign for Madrid. We work with financial services sector clients like APSA in Africa, and luxury clients as well. So it's a real breadth of the stories that our team kind of comes up with in terms of ideation and produces as a result. And the content that we create is also very multi-platform. And another kind of differentiator for StoryWorks is that because we are a broadcaster with a digital footprint and an audio footprint, we can tell stories in a very kind of 360 way, if you will.
And is there a specific sort of content that brands are most excited about creating, kind of when the BBC name's attached to that storytelling?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to go back to that trust element, because that is the single most kind of important value we bring to brands, right, when they're working with us. And it's very important for us to deliver on that for clients through branded content. So kind of fact checking and verifying sources, and also with stories that excite and entertain our BBC audience while being informative, trustworthy, and educational. So our motto as StoryWorks stands true with the BBC's motto, which is to entertain, educate, and inform. And that's true of our editorial output, our entertainment output, as well as branded content too.
You mentioned it just now. You wouldn't expect us to ignore it. Audio is obviously a platform that is in the BBC's wheelhouse. It's a really fast-growing part of the media mix. So where does audio fit into BBC StoryWorks? Do you think it's a valuable storytelling medium?
You're absolutely right, Neil. So, first and foremost, audio is in the BBC's DNA. As a company, the BBC has been pushing boundaries in this space for more than 100 years. For example, the launch of the first BBC radio station was back in 1922. So with that, BBC is one of the largest producers of audio content in the world. And we deliver more than 100 hours of original audio every day, with more than 1 billion global downloads per year. That's a significant number. And so as BBC StoryWorks, we take this heritage in audio and translate that for our branded content work in audio. There are so many advantages, I think, when it comes to audio storytelling, especially for brands. One of the things that I think are really beneficial is that audio and podcasts are hyper-targeted, right? So it offers kind of a very high level of audience segmentation and are a great way of targeting niche interests and communities. We've seen at the BBC that they have a growing reach among younger, kind of more affluent and ethnic minority demographics as well. The second thing is that audio is super impactful. So it provides this very premium and immersive environment and creates kind of high ad engagement throughout in-depth storytelling. So, for example, you've probably seen this statistic, 90% of listening is via headphones. It's almost like you are talking to a friend without any disruptions of like tabs near you, right? And I think for podcast campaigns, they're really an effective tool for delivering strong returns on ad spend, especially when placed across kind of multiple editorial podcasts too.
Yeah, so that's talking about creating an ad to sit within the existing BBC content. Are you getting a bigger appetite for brands to start creating their own podcast series as opposed to just advertising inside them?
Yeah, we've seen a growth for both formats of audio kind of products. So, with the growth of audio as a platform, it's only natural that brands are looking to this platform to tell their stories too. And it's very interesting to see how some sectors are really embracing it. So, for example, there's been a handful, and Michaela, you bring up kind of a branded podcast series, right? A handful of kind of great branded podcast series in the financial sector, for example, that I've seen within StoryWorks and outside of StoryWorks, which makes total sense. And I think, often financial stories are less about maybe kind of visually rich storytelling and more about the conversations, right? The in-depth conversations, discussions around certain topics. And it's only natural for this to be told through a format like audio. Another trend that I've seen is that luxury is another sector that's been really embracing audio storytelling. And I think this is very similar to the financial services sector in a way that the stories in this space involve discussion and a medium that can present those discussions in a very intimate way to audiences.
And you have been at New York Times before, which obviously also has a very rich audio heritage.
Yes.
It's really interesting that essentially the sort of thoughtful, high quality publishers are the ones leading audio, and clearly there's a wide range. But I think particularly in the branded space, you've got high quality brands, as you say, luxury or financial, who are looking to exploit the quality of audio content. Also, let's be fair, it's cheaper to create high quality audio content and simpler to create high quality audio content than it is to create a very luxurious video, for instance, isn't it? So you're able to sort of reach that level of quality within a budget that is perhaps more attainable, within a timescale that's more attainable. But I think it's that marriage of well-respected platforms, high-quality brands, and high-quality content is one that, we've seen grow hugely in the last few years, and it's clearly not going away. Have you seen the briefs change much? Have you seen audio be included in brand briefs in a way that they weren't previously?
Yeah, really good question. And, briefs from brands, I think, are very telling in what the market and audiences are wanting at a certain period in time. So, yes, brand briefs, even if they're from the same brand, can be radically different from a year ago, 5 years ago, and so forth. And I think the consistent evolution of brand briefs is that they are wanting to storytell around purpose. And it's rarely, I'm sure you've noticed this, it's rarely about a hard sell, especially when it comes to branded content as opposed to straightforward advertising. And this kind of purpose-driven storytelling is really exciting to think about for someone like me, who loves stories, always did, and brands are savvier, audiences are savvier. And as a result, the branded content industry has become much more interesting in the last 10 years with really innovative storytelling that's, again, very often multi-platform, not just kind of catered to a certain niche brand audience, but stories that really have global resonance, have more legs, and it can change someone's view on something. And that's really powerful and exciting to be a part of.
You're right. It's those stories that are based on some kind of universal insight that we can empathize with, or that we can kind of become emotionally attached to. Because as you say, whether it's B2C or B2B, at the end of the day, we're all humans, and you want to create something.
Exactly.
If it's purpose-led, that means that you kind of think or feel differently as a result of hearing that content. And I think that's, as you say, the exciting bit for me is that you can actually have a genuine impact on somebody. And it just happens to be that it's from a brand. And then the kind of halo effect of that being that you feel differently about that brand as a result.
Exactly. Again, it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. A good story is a good story. And people, throughout our kind of marketing research have seen they don't really care if there's a logo from a brand attached to it or not, if it's an editorial. If they like that story, they're going to read it one way or the other.
So we talked earlier about the evolution of briefs and being able to kind of see how the market's changing, how people are changing what they see as important, and that's kind of driven by their audiences. What do you think the future evolution will be? Where do you think kind of the next change might be in the sort of briefs and potentially the sort of brands that you're hearing from?
There's kind of multiple parts to that. I think in terms of kind of the purpose of a brand, that's going to change with how the world is changing, right? So we've seen, for example, a ton of briefs on sustainability, as any other publisher would tell you, whether that's kind of ESG driven or kind of more specific sustainability initiatives that brands are a part of. We see a lot of briefs that want to tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion in some way, as well as kind of other kind of purpose-driven initiatives. In terms of kind of the formats, what I'm very excited about, and you can see that kind of with big kind of luxury brands and kind of brands like Unilever, for example, in kind of the branching out of kind of longer format branded content. So, branded entertainment, I guess, in a way, where it's not kind of like 2 to 4 minute short films distributed on social or digital that people are looking for. It's, kind of Hollywood feature film length films. It's kind of longer branded audio podcast series on Apple and Spotify, for example, which I think again, goes to show the impact that branded content has had on the media industry.
Brilliant. Thank you.
It's really important that you say that, because when we were talking earlier about long form conversations and financial podcasts in particular, there's a tendency to think of a podcast sometimes as just it's two people talking in a room at length, which is fine and is often a really strong format. But encouraging brands to think of the sort of podcast they love listening to, whether that's investigative, whether it's entertaining, it might be more creatively ambitious. Getting brands to go down that road rather than the obvious route of, as I say, a head-to-head conversation is harder. But do you think that's more likely these days?
Absolutely. And again, I think as many formats and different types of stories that are out there in the world, whether that's branded or not, the branded content industry and clients will want the same thing. One thing that we know about media in general is that people get bored in this industry very often, right? And we all have quite short attention spans, and we always want something new and exciting to engage with. So absolutely, I think kind of more kind of formats, different types of storytelling, we're going to see a lot of appetite around that for brands.
Jainnie, thank you very much
Thank
indeed
you.
for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. We look forward to working with you more and hearing more from BBC StoryWorks.
Thank you.
Right, let's move on to some other stuff that's happening in the audio world.
So I've been talking a lot more recently about podcast advertising. People know Fresh Air for the podcasts that we make for brands who want their own show. But this year we've launched Fresh Air Media, which is all about podcast advertising and how brands want to get into that space and tell their story to podcast listeners using hosts and the brilliant medium that goes around the shows that people love. And there's some research out recently from the guys at Kantar. We love Kantar. They have a huge amount of data. And some of the stuff they've been looking at with podcasts is around the targeting of niche versus mass audiences and how marketeers are sort of latching on to the podcast world as a place to shout about their brand. So you'll be glad to know, Michaela, that 41% of marketers globally plan to increase their spending on podcast advertising in 2025.
Not only am I excited about this research, Neil, but I also know that it will be particularly exciting for Richard, our Director of Marketing, who has his own mug with Data Geek, or I Love Data written on it, because this is the stuff that he lives for.
He'll be chuffed to bits. Particularly, actually, amongst high impact, high ticket categories. Goes back to what we were talking about with Jainnie, that things like automotive, luxury brands, they see a 2.8 times increase in purchase intent. So 280% increase in purchase intent as a result of hearing a podcast ad, and 2.4 times brand favorability. So all this stuff just feeds into everything that we know about audio being a compelling channel and a persuasive channel. It's seen as trustworthy, relevant, useful by the audience, but it's also, this is key for you, I know, on the creative side, people also say it's something they try to ignore. So podcast listeners say it's a message they try to ignore. So the key is how you stop ignoring it.
I am very glad that you said that, actually, because I think that when you're being interrupted in a listen by a message from somebody else, that interruption has to be worthwhile. So the way of framing that ad or that message needs to be as creative and as conscious of the environment that it's sitting in as possible, so that people actually want to engage with it and want to keep listening rather than pressing that skip button.
There's a key point in here as well, which we have covered on this program before, which is don't just stick your radio ad on a podcast, because nobody wants that.
Please don't do that.
And they're completely different environments. It's a completely different listening experience, isn't it?
It is. And particularly when you consider that a lot of radio listening is music-led radio stations and podcasting is speech-led. So even from that very basic context, the way of of breaking through and having resonance and kind of having cut through is completely different. So it's just being really, really considerate of the context, contextual advertising all the way.
Right, what have you got?
Well, the tail end of last week was all about Spotify Wrapped. I don't think any of us could ignore that, particularly within the bubble that we exist in. It's the celebration of the year on Spotify for both podcasts and clients and creators, but also for us personal Spotify account holders. And we've been sharing them with our clients and will continue to do so over the next week. It's a really interesting portrait of how your podcast has performed on Spotify. That is the caveat, on Spotify over the last year, with some data gifts along the way. Things like the percentage gain of streams and followers, what new fans you might have, your kind of demographics and the countries you're listened in, and also how many people your show is their absolute number one show, which is one that I really like.
It's great, isn't it, that Spotify have this data that they sort of sit on for the year, and we sort of don't mind that they sit on it because they give it to us in a nice present in December.
I think it's a great gift for our clients. It didn't feel like such a great gift personally when I got my own Spotify Wrapped through, because it made me realise how much it was skewed by the two near teens that I have in the house. And I don't know if I'd want to be my personal audio brand. We talk so much about how it's important to understand what your audio identity, what your audio personification would be. And I think that mine would boil down to a mixture of Taylor Swift and Christmas songs since October, if that's what I went by, which was disturbing.
Yeah, mine was grandmother slow dance piano rock, which I don't know what that says about me, but essentially that is the music I apparently listen to. Grandmother slow dance piano rock.
I had a shift in energy, apparently, to Pink Pilates Princess Pop Strut, which I'll take that. I quite like that. I'll take that.
That sounds very you. The other thing to shout about is that the final episode of L'Oreal's This Is Not a Beauty podcast went live this week. We talked to Raquel from T-Brand, the content studio of New York Times Advertising, a few weeks ago with this brilliant show. But yes, it is the full series is out now, with Isabella Rossellini exploring the relationship between beauty and health and all sorts of other aspects of our lives. So please do look up that. It's a great example of what we were talking about with Jainnie earlier, of a high-class brand, a high-class broadcaster creating really high-value content.
Yeah, search for This Is Not a Beauty podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And now, as promised, it's time for our podcast recommend. This week, it comes courtesy of Jainnie Cho herself.
Hi, my name is Jainnie Cho, and I'm VP of BBC StoryWorks at BBC Studios. My podcast recommend is Spilled Milk, hosted by writers and comedians Molly Weisenberg and Matthew Amsterburton. Each episode focuses on one food-related topic, so whether that's apples, gorgonzola cheese, Japanese convenience store food, or bibimbap. I love it because it can be quite niche at times with the food topics the hosts choose, but I get to learn something new, and it's really informal and funny, like you're talking to your foodie friends in a cafe. So whenever I'm headed into town or the office with a very action-packed day, I love to listen to Spilled Milk during my commute and lighten my mood a bit and laugh.
And that's all we have time for in this episode. We really hope you've enjoyed it. And if you want to check us out or find out how to get started with your very own podcast, be that a podcast or be that part of Fresh Air Media's new wing in terms of buying your own podcast advertising or creating a podcast ad that isn't your radio ad, then check out our website, freshair.audio.
Plus, if you want juicy, fun, audio-related newsletter landing in your inbox every Friday, then you can sign up for our weekly Fresh Air newsletter too. You can find it on LinkedIn or via the website. Thank you very much for listening.
Fresh Air.